Hey, so how many of you in the last week got to choose your own adventure? Anybody? 5 of you, awesome. I got to choose my own adventure last week when I got an email from a publisher telling us that we had violated trademark law by using the title, Choose Your Own Adventure, for this series. So in case you're wondering why it says Choose Your Best Adventure up there, now you know, right? Okay, and more on that later. I'll get to that in a little bit. But before we do that, we all like adventures, right? I mean, we're all living in adventure. That's kind of the premise of this series. And I'm curious, if you could choose your best adventure, if you could choose somewhere to go or something to do, whether it's Europe or Asia, or my favorite would be the Incan Trail leading up to Machu Picchu. I'd love to do that sometime. What I want you to do is think about what your best adventure would be. And I'm going to give you 10 seconds to introduce yourself to somebody next to you. You get to choose who, right? And tell them what your best adventure is, okay? So 10 seconds, think real hard. Ready, set, go. Time's up. Time's up. We're not going to let you talk in church anymore. If you, come on, just kidding. Yeah, I mean, obviously, we love adventures, right? I mean, that's like my favorite genre of movies, Jason Bourne and all that good stuff, Fast, Furious. I know some people really like those. We're all living an adventure, and we really all get to choose. Now, you could be here today, and you don't feel like you've gotten to choose much of anything. In fact, maybe you didn't choose to be here, but somebody chose you to be here. Or if sometimes teenagers, we feel like our parents are choosing our adventure for us when we're in teenage years. I don't know if you've ever felt that before, but there's a quote that I ran across, I don't know, probably when I was a teenager, I think, but it's by a pastor named Chuck Swindoll, and here's what he said. He said, life is 10% what happens to me, and 90% how I react to it. Life is 10% what happens to me, 90% how I react to it. And the truth is, we all do get to choose. You may not get to choose everything that happens in your life, but you do get to choose how you respond, and it's your response that makes all the difference. Now, last week, I asked a really important question, and I hope if you were with us, you were able to think about it. And if you weren't with us, here's kind of my plug. I would encourage you to go online to icommunitychurch.com, and you can listen in or you can watch. But the question was, are you lost? Are you lost? Because the truth is, sometimes as we're adventuring in life, we find ourselves at a place where we never wanted to be, and we don't know how we got here, and we don't know how to get out of here. And sometimes we're just at a place called lost. And we spent a lot of time last week talking about that and talking about how to move out of that space. In fact, one of the important things, kind of the principle that we talked about last Sunday, is that the adventures we choose have predictable outcomes. And so the best way to predict where your adventure is taking you is to look down the road where you're headed right now, right? The adventures we choose have predictable outcomes, and the best way to predict where you'll end up is to look down the road to see where you're headed right now so that we can avoid getting to the place of lost, so we can avoid getting to that spot where we don't know where we are and we don't know how we got there. The thing we talked about last week is that paths are predictable. When you get on a road, it takes you wherever that road takes you. And the same is true in our decisions in life. And I invited you to ask the question, are my paths leading me where I want to go? Right? In my relationships, are my relational paths, the way that I'm dating, the way that I handle my marriage, the way that, I'm raising my kids, or the way that I'm dealing with my parents or my friends at school, are my relational paths leading me where I want to go? Or my educational paths, or my career paths, or my financial paths, or the way I eat ice cream paths, whatever it is. Are they leading me? Are they taking me where it is ultimately that I want to go in life? Now, the problem for so many of us is that we like to walk down the paths of least resistance, right? I mean, that's just kind of how we are by nature. I mean, we live life kind of passively. For example, you may be dating somebody and you didn't intend to date that person. You just kind of ran into each other and it's like, well, what else is there to do? Let's date, right? Or I mean, it could be that you have a job or you have a job opportunity and you didn't go looking for it. It came looking for you, and not intentionally, you just kind of took it because it seemed like, an opportunity, or your kid signed up for something. You didn't know what the commitment was going to be, or, you're sitting there with the tub of ice cream or a bag of Oreos and you just keep eating and you don't really realize that until it's all gone, right? And what path you're headed down. And the truth is, there are just times in life where we live life passively because it's the path of least resistance. But the invitation for us in this series is to quit doing that because it's our passive living that leads us to the place of lost. It's when we fail to really think about where this path is taking me that we discover ourselves at a place where we never wanted to be. And quite honestly, that's the last place I want for you, and it's the last place I want for me. which I think is why Solomon said this in Proverbs chapter 4, verse 26. He said, ponder the path of your feet. Ponder, really think about the paths of your feet, and then your ways will be sure. Now, as you go out today, this is a little precursor, we had this made into a window cling, that verse, and I want to invite you to kind of commit this to memory. It's a window cling, so you can put it on the mirror in your bathroom, you can put it on the dashboard of your car, or the mirror or the window of your car. I mean, you can put it wherever it will be helpful on your computer. Put it at a place where you'll remember it and begin to think that I need to consider and think really strongly about the paths of my feet and the direction that I'm heading down. Because the truth is, we have all, myself included, we have all been at the place of lost before. And the last thing I want for you, and the last thing I want for me, is that we're at the place of lost again. So ponder, ponder, ponder. Think about, be intentional with the paths that you choose. Because that one-time decision, that date, that job, that spring break, that Friday night, it is not a one-time decision. That tub of ice cream, it is not a one-time decision. I'm admitting my own challenge. It's not a one-time decision. It is a path that we walk down, and it has a predictable outcome. So today, we're going to talk about how to kind of continue pondering the path of your feet and what exactly that looks like. And I'll just say this, if you're under 30 years old, I think that this is super relevant. I think this whole series, I hope it is helpful because it has the potential of being preventative for you, meaning you don't have to get to the place of loss. If you kind of begin putting some of these practices or principles into practice, you're going to keep away from the place of loss. For those of us who are 30 and over, I think there are actually a couple challenges for us as it comes to this, and it's not that the content's any less relevant. The challenge, first one, is sometimes we become blind to the paths that we're on. Right? I mean, you've maybe had your head down and you've just been walking and trudging along on that path for a long time, and you've never zoomed out to see that 30,000-foot view, and so you're just kind of blind to where your path is headed. Sometimes we do that. And the other piece is that sometimes we get so comfortable in our path that we don't care where it's headed, which is a little bit tragic, but we've all felt that to some degree at some point in time, because you've heard somebody tell you their life problems, and you've looked at those problems and you've said to yourself, I'll keep mine, right? Anybody else felt that before when somebody's laying out all the things they're dealing with? You're like, yeah, you can deal with that. I'll keep my own stuff. I'm bedfellows with those, and I know, what my issues are, and I'm comfortable with those. But the invitation for all of us throughout this series is to hold our hands open with our lives and say, God, are there different paths? Are there better paths for me to be on? And would I have the courage to step in the direction that you are leading me to step in? So today we're going to talk specifically about decisions that you and I make on a regular basis. And I'm going to teach you a question. At the end of the message, I'm going to teach you a question to begin asking as you process the questions that kind of come up inevitably as you're walking down the path, right? And we're not talking about, you're in the center and there's a hub of choices. We're talking about you're walking down a path and there's, a crossroads. And you've got to decide, do I go left or do I go right? Do I continue straight or do I turn to the side? Which way should I ultimately go? I want to be really clear that these are not moral decisions, okay? So we're not talking about morality. We're not talking about breaking the laws of the land. If you're debating, should I steal or should I deal drugs? The answer is no, okay? I mean, that's kind of self-explanatory. I think you can figure those out on your own. And we're not talking about moral things, right? In fact, if you thumb through the pages of the New Testament, there are all kinds of moral instructions and imperatives for those of us who are followers of Jesus. And so I'd encourage you, read your Bible. Read your Bible. There's some great stuff in there, and that'll help you along with those questions. But what about the other things we deal with, right? I mean, what about the everyday, day-to-day, day-in, day-out questions? You're in the middle of an argument, or you could call it a discussion with your spouse, right? Or your boyfriend or girlfriend, or with your parents, or with your friends at school. How do you handle yourself? Or the job opportunity comes up, and what decision do you make? Somebody cuts you off on the interstate and you're kind of irritated about it. So how do you respond to that? What do you do? Or when you parent, how are you going to parent? Or you're at a restaurant, right? And the food wasn't what you hoped it would be. And the service maybe wasn't what you'd hoped it'd be either. How do you respond in those situations? In the day-to-day decisions that we face in life, how do you know what it is that you should do? Now, there's an additional category for those of us who grew up in church that I think what we're going to talk about today will be helpful with. And that's for those of us who grew up in maybe an overly religious environment. What do we do with kind of those religious rules that we learned as children? Things like, is it okay to drink alcohol? Things like, if I hit my thumb with a hammer and something comes out, do I have to ask for forgiveness for it? Should I feel bad or guilty, right? I mean, how should I spend my money? How should I invest my resources? There are important questions to ask. And so the question that I'm going to give you in just a minute is important for a number of reasons. The first reason is that sometimes it's kind of like the last question on our mind. It's not that we never think about it. It's just not doesn't really bubble to the surface a whole lot. And the second reason why this is important is because for those of us who call ourselves followers of Jesus, our goal is to draw closer to Jesus, right? Our goal is to draw closer to him and to love him more and more. And I'm telling you, asking this question will lead you to that place. So there's kind of an underlying assumption that I'm making for those of us who are Christians in the room that we want to know God more. And I'm telling you, this question will help you lead you to that place. And so as followers of Jesus, we need to be asking this question. Now, if you're here today and you really relate to my comment earlier about you didn't choose to be here and somebody dragged you here and you're thinking, great, this doesn't even apply to me, and you're not sure what you believe about God, or you're not sure if you even believe the Bible is real, I just want you to know I'm glad you're here, and this may kind of highlight one of the things that kind of irritates you about Christians because we're not very good at asking this question. But if you will ask this question, you'll discover something amazing in your life. You will discover your best adventure. And I think that best adventure will lead you to Jesus, but you can ask the question whether you want to be led to Jesus or not. So how's that for way of introduction? If you got your Bible, I want to invite you to open it up. We're going to be in a letter in the New Testament. It's in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Now, if you didn't bring a Bible, don't worry, we'll have it up here on the screen in just a minute. Now, I want to talk about, there's a piece of following Jesus that's a challenge for everybody. And that is, what does it mean exactly to follow Jesus? What does it mean to follow Jesus? This was a challenge for the last 2,000 years, for the very first people who followed him. What does it mean to follow Jesus? And I would argue that it's easier for us 2,000 years later to answer that question than it was 2,000 years ago, because the United States has been influenced by Christianity more than by any other faith or religious or philosophical system. Let me give you an example. A couple weeks ago, I was reading about a New York Times best-selling book, and there was a quote in the book, and the quote said, "The universe loves you," which I thought was really funny, because I'm thinking to myself, the universe doesn't love anybody, right? I mean, the universe isn't capable of loving. But the idea behind the quote, this is really important, don't miss this. The idea behind the quote is that there's this concept and construct of love, and we want to believe that there is something or someone out there that does love us, right? That the gods, that the universe, that God loves us. But do you know where that concept of love comes from? It doesn't come from any pagan or non-Christian religion. That's just what the word pagan means, non-Christian religion. It doesn't come from any other philosophical system. It comes from Christianity. Because John, the apostle of Jesus, who spent time with Jesus, 3 years with him, he looked at Jesus and says, "I have seen love with my own two eyes." And you know what? God is love. I have recognized that God is love. And so for us 21st century Christians, I mean, some of this is kind of baked into our culture and it's baked into the way we think, and that's the influence of Christianity for 2,000 years. But 2,000 years ago, people didn't know what to do. And hey, people are messy, right? We're a mess, you're a mess, I'm a mess, we're all messy. And so 2,000 years ago, it was like, okay, what does it mean to follow Jesus? I've got to figure this out. How do I live? What do I say? I mean, what should my life look like? And they were really wrestling with this. And so many of the letters in the New Testament are addressing those questions. How do I deal with this? And this particular letter we're looking at, 1 Corinthians, it was kind of helping to answer that question. Okay, well, so what does it look like for a follower of Jesus to make day-to-day decisions in his life or in her life? Now, I want to give a little bit of context because it's going to be a little bit strange, and I'll try and explain it the best I can. These people who had become followers of Jesus, they had grown up going to all kinds of temples for Roman gods and goddesses. And at the temple, you would bring a sacrifice. You would bring meat, and you'd offer the sacrifice to the gods because it was believed that the gods were hungry, and they wanted people to feed them. Well, lo and behold, the gods didn't really eat a whole lot, right? Because statues of wood and stone and metal, they don't eat food. And it never dawned on them to ask the question, why do they not eat this? But they continued doing it. And so what they would do is they'd offer sacrifices to the temple. The gods weren't very hungry. The food would be left over. And so they would take the food and they would sell it at the meat market in town. It's like, think the clearance section at Kroger, because this meat's already been sacrificed. I can't, re-sacrifice it, so I can buy it to eat. And so Christians of that day were trying to figure out, am I allowed to buy this meat? Am I allowed to eat this? I mean, is that right? Is there something immoral about it? And again, we can't relate to that, but there are some principles behind this that I promise you'll be able to relate to, and it all makes sense here in just a minute. So 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 23, here's what Paul says, and he says something we can relate to, and quite honestly, it was a mantra of the time. He says, I have the right to do anything, you say. Have you ever felt that way before? I have the right to do anything. You can't tell me what to do. I'm my own person. Don't judge me. This is my decision. I can do whatever I want. Now, the Corinthians were able to say this because in Christianity, you may not know this. It's important to know, though. The goal of Christianity isn't to be good. Did you know that? The goal of Christianity isn't to be good. In fact, the message of Christianity is you can't be good. And because you can't be good, Jesus came and he was perfect for you in ways that you could never have been perfect, and he died for you so that you could be forgiven. And so the instructions to Christians is not to be good. In fact, Jesus was asked, what are the greatest commandments? And he gave two, and those two commandments start with one four-letter word that begins with the letter L. Let's see who knows it. It was love. Good job. Man, I'm proud of you all. Yeah, love. Love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. So the Corinthians are like, hey, I can do whatever I want, right? As long as I'm loving, right? I can do whatever I want. Paul says, not so fast. I have the right to do anything you say, but not everything is beneficial. Just because I can do anything doesn't mean I should do anything. I could light bottle rockets out of my gas can. That would not be beneficial, right? There are all kinds of things. You could say whatever you want in the middle of a fight with your spouse. That would not be beneficial, okay? So we recognize, we can get that. He says, I have the right to do anything, he continues on, but not everything is constructive. Not everything builds up. Again, you can think about, I don't know why arguments so quickly come to my mind, right? But there are times where you want to say something, and maybe you do say something, and you realize that this wasn't constructive in solving the problem. It only created more problems. Now, the word constructive here, it's really a fun Greek word to say, and so I'm going to teach it to you just so you can walk away saying you learned at least something today. And so the Greek word is oikodomeo. Oikodomeo. Can you say it with me? Oikodomeo. It's kind of fun, right? You can just use it all throughout this week. Oikodomeo, as you choose your best adventures, you can use that word. Oikodomeo really means to build something or someone up. It means to build someone or something up. And the implication is that there is a community of people around you. Now, sometimes we forget that there's a community of people around us, right? Sometimes we forget. But Paul's understanding is, look, you and I, we've got a community. Your community could be your family, could be your parents or your kids, could be your spouse or significant other, boyfriend, girlfriend. It could be your school community. Those of you who started school in the last week, you've got a community there. It could be your team. It could be your employer or your work community. It could be your sports community. Here at church, you've got a community. Those of you who call this your church home, you've got a community here. Some of you even have community groups. You've got a community. We've got a Batesville community, Indiana community. You get the idea. There are people around us. And Paul's point is that the closer in proximity someone is to you in community, the bigger impact your decision has on them. And so as you're kind of going along in life and you're at a crossroads and you're trying to figure out, what do I do? I've got this job opportunity. Do I take this job? I'm in this argument. Do I continue, down this path of saying what it is that I think I want to say? Or, I'm at school and everybody's making fun of somebody else. And do I join into that? And Paul says, at this crossroads, you've got freedom to do whatever it is that you want to do, but you can't forget that there are people around you. And that there are people around me, and that the people around us need to be considered. He goes on, He says, no one, which is Greek for no one, right? I mean, not some people, not a few people, but no people. No one should seek their own good, but what's that say? But the good of others. Now think about this for just a minute with me. Because could you imagine if that became the litmus test of decision-making in our country? I mean, can you imagine? I mean, forget just this room. I mean, I think it would be impactful here. But from a national level, if we just began asking that question, what's really for the good of others? So we think about the shootings that took place a week ago. And we talk about how do we manage this? Well, what's really for the good of others? Rather than just what's good for me, what's good for all of us? What's good for others? As we think about the music that we listen to and the content of the lyrics that we listen to, contexts that are sometimes racially charged, sometimes are sexually charged or demeaning of certain genders and using words that are, I mean, what's really for the good of others? Is it just good for me? Or is it good for we? Right? A couple weeks ago, I was with my middle daughter, Noelle, and we had gone to CVS to pick something up. And when we're at CVS, as we walked up to the counter, right at counter level, which is her eye level, there's a Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition right there for her to take a look at. And I thought to myself, we're sending a message to this 3-year-old that beauty is skin deep with a tiny bikini and a talented Photoshop artist. And really, what's good? What's good for our kids? What's good for boys? What's good for adult men? Are we looking to the good of ourselves, or are we looking to the good of others? In the political conversation, right? In the political conversation where we're focused on scoring political points rather than moving the conversation of our country forward, are we really looking and asking the question, what's good for others? Think about it at school, guys. I mean, for those of you who started school in the last week and you're sitting around lunch tables or in locker rooms or wherever it is that you're having conversations, study hall, and people are joining in, making fun of somebody else, and you don't want to become the butt of jokes. Do you think about what's good for others, or do you think about what's good for you? Parents, man, I'll just be honest, this is a struggle for me at times. Do I really look to what's for the good of my kids rather than what's convenient and easy for me? Because I'll tell you what, if I did, there are times when I would discipline when I don't discipline because it's not convenient for me and it's not easy and I'd rather just, put up with it for a season. But I'm not looking at the long-term health of my kids. I'm not looking to the long-term goodness of my kids who believe they can grow up and the world, revolves around them. We have got to we've got to start considering and asking that question, what's really good for the other people? Because it's not just about what's okay for me. If it's not good for we, then it can't be good for me. If it's not good for we, then it can't be good for me. I realize that doesn't rhyme, or it has bad grammar. It does rhyme. That's why I chose it. So those of you grammarians who are like, what, that doesn't work. It does, trust me, okay? And so, listen, I'm telling you, this is so important. In fact, it's so important. I want you to repeat it after me. I'm gonna say it one more time, and then you can repeat it with me, because I think this just needs to seep into our heads. If it's not good for we, it can't be good for me. Ready? If it's not good for we, then it can't be good for me. It just can't. It just can't. And listen, here's the thing. Looking to our own interests and doing what's good for me, that is not from God. That is selfish. That is selfish. That is the sin nature that we are all born with. That thing inside of us that says it's all about me, I need to self-protect, it's all about what I want and what's good for me. But I'm telling you, that does not come from God, because the truth is you and I, we are in community with other people. We have a group of we's around us. And if we aren't looking to their good and to what's important for them, then we are just being selfish. That's what Paul says here. Now, again, he's talking about the non-moral decisions you and I make in life. He's not talking about breaking the law. He's not talking about breaking God's moral standards. So moving on, here's what he continues on, and he kind of explains this in the context of the meat we were talking about earlier. He says, eat anything sold in the meat market without raising question of conscience. Because you're wondering, is it okay if I eat this? The answer is, sure. If it doesn't bother your conscience, then Go right ahead, eat it. He goes on, he says, here's why. For the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. God created it all anyway, and we know these idols, they're not even real, so who cares? Go ahead and eat it. If it doesn't bother your conscience, go ahead and eat it. He goes on and he says, if an unbeliever, that's a non-Christian person, invites you to a meal and you want to go, eat whatever's put before you without raising questions of conscience. Don't worry about it. If somebody invites you over and you want to go over and they're offering food, they're offering drink, go ahead, partake in it. It's not that big of a deal. It's a matter of your conscience. Now, this is really important because you may be thinking, what in the world does that mean, right? I mean, what's my conscience? And I'm telling you, in 2 Sundays from now, we're going to talk about that. And we're going to talk about when things get into our hearts and how to make decisions and revolving of that. So don't miss that. But his point is, look, don't violate your conscience. Don't violate your conscience and don't offend your host. And so you're wondering, is it okay to eat and drink? Go ahead, eat and drink. Don't get drunk. Is it okay, as we Christians, we wrestle with some of these things, go ahead, do it. There's freedom here. There is absolute freedom, but don't violate your conscience. But then he goes on, and he adds another dimension. He says, but if someone says to you, and this is like, you're in Midbite, right? This food has been offered in sacrifice, and you've got that fork, right up to your mouth, and you're about to take a bite, and there's somebody with you who's like, dude, no, you can't eat that. That's been sacrificed to idols. What are you thinking? That's kind of the situation he's describing here. He says, then do not eat it, both for the sake of the one who told you and for the sake of conscience. It's like, Paul, you are not making any sense. You just told me if my conscience is okay with it, go ahead. And Paul's like, no. We need to think about we rather than just me because there are others here. And then he goes on, he explains, he says, I'm not referring to the other person's conscience, or I'm referring rather to the other person's conscience, not yours. You say, well, why does theirs matter? But why is my freedom being judged by another person's conscience? Why should that matter? If I take part in the meal with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of something I thank God for? Why do I need to consider them? And Paul's saying, look, if you're flying solo living on a desert island, then you don't need to consider them. But you're not. And I'm not. And we don't live in a vacuum, and we're not the only ones sucking air here on earth. There are other people, and if we're in relationship with other people, then we need to consider what's best for we rather than thinking only of me. That's Paul's point. And then he goes on, he says, it's not just about food. That's the particular thing that the Corinthians were wrestling with. He says it's not just about food. Verse 31, he says, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, blanket statement that encompasses everything, he says, do it all. Not some, but all, for the glory of, who's that say? God. For the glory of God. This isn't about you. This isn't about what you want. This isn't about your preferences and desires. It's not about being right. It's not about being justified. It's not about saying, I can do whatever I want, because the goal isn't to be good anyway. It's about glorifying God by considering the needs of others. You may say, what in the world does that mean? I mean, how does considering the needs of others glorify God? How does that honor and praise God? Because that's really what the word glorify means. Well, the answer is that when we consider the needs of others, we act like Jesus. Because 2,000 years ago, he stepped onto the earth and he considered the needs of you and he considered the needs of me. And he looked at all of our needs and he said, look, I'm going to do something incredibly uncomfortable. I'm going to live a perfect, sinless life. I'm going to be accused of things that I didn't do. I'm going to be betrayed by the people who are closest to me. I'm going to be beaten and flogged and put on a cross. And I'm going to give my life for the good of others, not because it's good for me, but because it's good for we, because it's good for you, because it's good for all of us. And so when we willingly choose to do that, this is so important, when we willingly choose to do that, we make ourselves like Jesus. He goes on, he says, do not cause anyone to stumble. Do not cause anyone to stumble, whether Jews, that's the non-Christian Jews, whether Greeks, that's non-Christian non-Jews, or the church of God, which was the Christians. In other words, anybody, right? Don't cause anybody to stumble. It doesn't matter where they are in the faith journey. Cause no offense. Your goal is to help them come to faith. He goes on, he says, even as I try to please everyone in every way, for I am not seeking my own good, but the good of many, so that they may be saved. And here's what Paul was saying. If something I want to do gets in the way of somebody coming to faith, then I'm going to bend in their direction. And I'm going to move in the direction of what is best for we rather than thinking only about me. And you may ask yourself the question and say, well, how far do I need to take that? Right? I mean, how far do I need to go with that line of thinking? And Paul would say, well, how far did Jesus take it? How far did Jesus take it? He took it to death. And he gave up his life. And he said, come follow me. He said, take up your cross and follow me. And so the invitation for every one of us, is to consider the needs of others before we think solely of ourselves. So I know at the beginning I said there's going to be a question here, and maybe you've figured out what that question ultimately is going to be. But the question is, does this choice benefit we or just me? Does this choice benefit we or just me? Now, in order to ask that question, this is important, it requires two things. It requires maturity, because I can guarantee you, young kids aren't capable of asking that question because the world just revolves around them too much. But as we grow to maturity, me moving to the place where I can say, it's not just all about me and it's all about what I want. It requires maturity to be able to ask that question, but it also requires humility, because it says, I'm not that important in the whole scheme of things. That doesn't mean you don't have value. That doesn't mean you're not an important person. You are. You do have value. You're part of we. I mean, that's good news, right? Because if I'm looking to the best of we, that also includes me. It is to my best interest that we all move forward together. And so when I consider the needs of we, I am also considering the needs of me, but it requires humility. Now, here's the good news. Regardless of where you are on this faith journey, you can ask that question. Whether you're a follower of Jesus yet or not, whether you've been following him for 50 years, you can learn to ask that important question. Does this benefit we, or is it just benefit me? And what's interesting is you and I, we can look at the world around us and we can see a whole bunch of me's, right? I mean, we can do that. That's kind of what's gotten our country into the mess that we're in right now. We've got a whole bunch of me's, a bunch of me first millies looking at only what's beneficial to me, and we can see how the we has been damaged and how we as a country are not moving in the right direction. Elevating me causes we to lose. It doesn't help all of us move forward together. In fact, I think, man, if we as a country, as I said earlier, if we could begin asking this, how much better off would we be? But it starts with us. It starts in a small group. It starts, and that's how it catches fire and moves forward. I can guarantee you this. If you begin asking that question, your relationships will be better. Can you imagine a relationship where you are both looking out for the good of someone else? When you're both looking out for each other's good. That sounds like a happy, healthy marriage, doesn't it? I mean, that sounds like good. Teenagers, can you imagine how your parents would respond to you if you said, it doesn't really matter what I want, Mom and Dad. I want what's best for the family. You know what will happen if you ask that question or say that? They will drop on the floor, passed out, and you'll have to revive them, and then they'll be like, you can have whatever you want, right? I mean, because, where did you come from? They'll be so shocked if you could actually ask that question. But I'm telling you, man, when you teenagers, when you young kids start thinking about what's best for the whole family, and you parents start saying, what's best for our whole family, or in dating relationship, what's best for the other person? I mean, really, what's best for the guys on the team? At work, what's best? What's best? I don't necessarily want to help with this project, but it doesn't really help me, but it will help we. And so because of that, I'm going to give my time. What if we as people started asking that question? Does this benefit we or just me? I'm telling you, it would change the way we think about it. It would change your values. It would change your values. It would change the way people think about you. When you get to the end of your life, have you ever been to a funeral for somebody who was very selfish? It is a sad funeral to go to. People struggle to find something nice to say, but when you go to the funeral of somebody who gave his or her life away, oh my goodness, there are lines of people who are distraught and distressed at the death of that person because they realize this person added value to so many other people. And that person reflected the person of Jesus. Because inherently, we all know an adventure lived with me at the center, it's a very small adventure to live. It is. An adventure lived with me at the center is a very small adventure. So what if you began asking that very important question? Does this choice just benefit me, or is it all about we? Does this choice benefit we, or is it just me? In fact, the invitation I want to give you as we close today is to begin applying that question in your relationships and your circles in the coming week, in the community that you have, whether it's at home, whether it's at work, whether it's at school, whether it's with your neighbors. I mean, whatever community you find yourself in here at church, I mean, could you begin asking that question, and could you imagine how God might begin working in your life and in the lives of the people around you? Imagine you get home and you're tired and you want to put your feet up and kids want your attention and spouse wants help with whatever. If you said, does this benefit we or just me? Is this just all about me? You're at the lunch table and they're making fun of somebody else. Does this benefit we, or is it just about me? A book publisher emails you and says, you violated trademark. And you talk to a lawyer and you say, no, we didn't. We didn't violate trademark. But really, because this is a real story, does this benefit we or just me? How would it look for a publisher to receive an email from a pastor saying, I'm not going to do anything you asked me to do because you're wrong? It's a tough thing to wrestle with. It's an important thing to wrestle with. It requires maturity and humility to say, does this benefit we or just me? And I'm telling you, when you begin asking that question, you'll have a new lens to look at life, and it will make a difference in you choosing your best adventure. Now, next week, we're going to talk about what do we do when obstacles are in the path. We've chosen a path, we've tried to make good decisions, but suddenly there is an obstacle. How do we get over it? And we're going to answer that question next Sunday, and I hope you can be with us. But let me pray for us this morning. God, so often life is full of choices, right? I mean, we've just got so many choices to make, and sometimes it's not a right or wrong, yes or no, moral, immoral. Sometimes there's just tough choices, and we have to decide what to do. And God, I just pray, I'm compelled right now just to pray for our country, because the direction we're heading in is not a good direction, where depression's on the rise, suicides are on the rise, mass shootings are on the rise. Something's not right. And so I just pray as a people that we could stop thinking about me and start thinking about we. And I pray that that would start here in this room with these people who are here today as we are challenged with this, as we think about our circles of influence and the opportunities we have to make choices on a daily basis. Would you lead us, God, in the direction you want us to move in? And would we be willing to sacrifice ourselves for the good of we? So God, I just pray that you would give each one of us wisdom as we ask that question this week, and give us courage to do what's best for others. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.